April 17, 1944, somewhere near Avignon, southern France. The air was thick with humidity and the distant rumble of engines. Clouds dragged low across the horizon, as if weighed down by the smoke of a continent on fire. A convoy of olive-drab American trucks rumbled down a muddy road, their tires sinking into the soaked terrain. Soldiers inside were silent, eyes heavy, rifles resting across their laps. The war had eaten away at their sleep, their laughter, their youth. But then, something happened. One of the trucks pulled to a stop near a battered checkpoint. The door creaked open. An officer stepped down, his uniform stained with dust, his helmet dented from a recent shell burst. In one hand, he held a map. In the other, a glass bottle. Brown, curved, ice-cold. The red label intact, despite the grime. Coca Cola. He twisted the cap. A sharp hiss echoed under the cloudy sky. That tiny, familiar sound seemed to cut through the fog of war like a scalpel. He drank, slowly, deliberately, as if, for a moment, the world could be paused and remembered as something else. Not far away, hidden behind a hedgerow, a group of German spotters observed through binoculars. One of them chuckled under his breath. "Look at them," he muttered, "fighting a war with candy water." To many German officers, Coca Cola was the ultimate joke, a sugary drink for teenagers, a child's delight, not a soldier's fuel. That bottle, gleaming in the hand of a war-weary lieutenant, seemed to confirm what they had always believed. Americans were soft, spoiled, addicted to comfort. But they were wrong, because that bottle didn't just hold soda. It held something else, something far more dangerous than caffeine or carbonation. It held a system. From Berlin to Normandy, from the Arctic Circle to the sands of Tunisia, German officers had grown up studying Clausewitz and memorizing the tactics of Moltke. They believed wars were won by discipline, by doctrine, by blood and steel. And yet, here was an army that laughed too loudly, carried chocolate in their pockets, and drank Coca-Cola in the middle of a war zone. It didn't make sense, but it worked. That convoy, crawling through southern France, wasn't just carrying ammunition and fuel. It was carrying a message, not in words, but in rhythm, in confidence, in a strange, almost surreal normality that the Axis could never replicate. American soldiers were still young. Many were barely 20. Most had never left their hometowns. And yet, here they were, thousands of miles from home, navigating the most brutal conflict in human history, and still drinking the same soda they had in high school. There's a certain madness in that, or genius. German analysts watching the advance couldn't believe it. Soldiers smiling through cracked lips, sipping from glass bottles as artillery thundered just beyond the hills. There were no rations like this in the Wehrmacht, no soft drinks, no small comforts. Everything in the German machine was built for function, for austerity, for sacrifice. But what they didn't understand is that Coca-Cola wasn't a luxury. It was a weapon. Not in the traditional sense. It didn't fire bullets or drop bombs, but it carried something the German war machine couldn't manufacture. A psychological edge, a cultural current, a reminder of what the Americans were fighting for, and what they could afford to bring with them, because behind that bottle was an entire industrial empire, a production line that never slept, a country that could supply both the Pacific and European fronts, and still deliver cold drinks in a desert. To the Germans, that was absurd. To the Americans, it was Tuesday. That moment, a sip from a Coke bottle near a battlefield, was more than a break from the war. It was a display of dominance, quiet, casual, terrifying. Coca-Cola was declared an essential wartime product by President Roosevelt himself. It was protected, prioritized, and shipped with the same urgency as rations and radio parts. And it came to represent something far greater than just sugar and water. It was morale, bottled and delivered with precision. No one in the German ranks would say it out loud, but some began to wonder, how could a country so seemingly unserious fight so effectively? The answer was layered. While the Axis perfected tanks with surgical precision, America built thousands of trucks that didn't need to be perfect. They just needed to arrive. While German soldiers starved, American troops were handed cold soda in frontline outposts, not because it was necessary, but because it was possible. And that possibility scared them, because deep down, Even the most hardened German officer knew, if the enemy can fight a global war and still deliver ice-cold Coca Cola to their soldiers, what else are they capable of? The bottle became a symbol, not of weakness, but of reach, of resource, of rhythm. Coca Cola wasn't about sweetness. It was about systems, a reminder that for every glass bottle clutched in a soldier's hand, there were factories, supply lines, engineers, and logistics officers working in concert, silently, efficiently. This wasn't just a military operation, it was a cultural invasion, one bottle at a time. And when that officer capped his drink and returned to the cab of the truck, the convoy rolled on, past ruined villages, past the laughter of German scouts who were no longer laughing quite as hard, past the skepticism of an empire that didn't realize it was already beginning to lose. Because if you can bring Coca Cola to a war zone, you can bring anything. Now, if you made it this far, tell us in the comments what you think that bottle represented, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the stories history forgot to tell. Heinrich Müller had spent his entire adult life inside the machine, a career officer in the Wehrmacht, molded by years of doctrine, repetition, and reverence for tradition. Like many in the German high command, he believed in steel, cold, calculated steel. He believed wars were won through discipline, heritage, and sacrifice. And he believed, truly believed, that America was too soft to win anything. He was not alone. To the German elite, the United States was a paradox. Industrial, yes. Resourceful, of course. But morally, spiritually, weak. A country of jazz, chewing gum, comic books, and cola. They saw it in films smuggled across borders, heard it in the way American soldiers spoke over intercepted radio chatter. Relaxed, unpolished, unworthy. In staff meetings across Berlin, the narrative was consistent. German soldiers were warriors. Americans were consumers. One lived for struggle, the other avoided it. One endured harsh winters on black bread and blood. The other shipped crates of Coca Cola to war zones and sang songs around campfires. This perception ran deep. It was not just propaganda, it was doctrine. A superiority complex forged in trenches, sharpened in classrooms, reaffirmed by early victories. Poland fell in weeks. France, once seen as impenetrable, collapsed under blitzkrieg. Why would America be any different? To the Germans, America's way of war seemed absurd. While Germany relied on elite formations, America trained civilians at breakneck speed. While the Reich emphasized honor, precision, and tradition, the United States seemed to embrace chaos. Mass production, improvisation, and raw numbers. There were even jokes whispered among German officers that Americans fought their wars like they made their movies. Loud, wasteful, overproduced, and somehow profitable. But they missed something. The same country they mocked for its culture of convenience was building something they could not fully comprehend. An engine that did not care about elegance or even efficiency in the traditional sense. It cared about momentum, about scale, about durability. While German officers gave speeches about spirit and purity, American factories ran 24 hours a day, powered by immigrants, women, and workers who had never seen a battlefield. While Germany focused on optimizing every tank, every shell, every unit, America flooded the field. It was not about the perfect weapon. It was about 10 good enough ones, about 10,000, about 1,000,000. In Berlin, they viewed this as sloppy, as crude, as unsustainable. But it kept coming. Troop ships filled with men barely out of high school, planes that rained supplies across oceans, and, yes, bottles of Coca Cola. That bottle became a point of obsession. Not just because it was everywhere, but because of what it represented. In a single object, it defied the German worldview. It was pleasure in the midst of war, a soft drink on a hard battlefield, a smile when only grit was expected. Officers in the Luftwaffe couldn't comprehend it. They are still children, one pilot reportedly said, after witnessing American troops unloading crates of soda near a bombed village. They think they are on holiday. But the laughter didn't last, because something strange began to happen. The Americans were not breaking. They were not crumbling under pressure. In fact, they were pushing forward, harder than expected, with more supplies than should have been possible. Their tanks were not always elegant, but they kept moving. Their aircraft were not always the fastest, but they never stopped coming. And everywhere they went, they brought their culture with them. To many Germans, that was the most confusing part. This was not just a war of bullets and bombs. It was a war of identity. And America's identity, once dismissed as trivial, was now rolling across Europe in columns of steel and sound. Swing music echoed through field radios. Pin-up girls decorated aircraft fuselages, and in the hands of soldiers, that same glass bottle kept reappearing. Müller began to notice it in reports, not from generals, but from the ground. Intelligence notes mentioned American troops sharing Cokes with local. Children in Sicily. Prisoners spoke of crates being handed out at forward bases in Tunisia. And worst of all, German supply officers began to document how the morale of American troops seemed inexplicably high. In the chaos of war, morale is a weapon. And Müller, despite his convictions, understood that better than most. A soldier who believes he will win is twice as dangerous as one who simply obeys. And the Americans? They believed. He would never admit it out loud. But Müller felt something growing in the pit of his stomach, a suspicion, a fear. That maybe their entire worldview had a crack in it, that maybe, just maybe, they had misunderstood what made the enemy dangerous. They had measured the Americans by their aesthetics, their slang, their music, their soda, but they had not measured their capacity for adaptation. And now it was becoming obvious. The Wehrmacht, for all its precision and planning, was grinding itself down. Resources were thinning. Replacements were dwindling. Ammunition was counted by the bullet. Meanwhile, the Americans were landing on more beaches, building more roads, and handing out more drinks. It was humiliating, but it was happening. What was once seen as softness began to look like strength. What was once dismissed as decadence now looked like depth. The joke, once so easy to tell, had started to choke. Because the real difference was never about taste. It was about tempo. And while Germany was trying to control the chessboard, America was flipping the table and bringing its own game. No one in Müller's circle ever openly questioned the old beliefs. Pride and ideology were too strong for that. But the silence in the room grew longer with each new report. And somewhere, in the back of their minds, they knew. The enemy they had mocked for drinking soda was now drinking victory. If you're enjoying this kind of story, show us some love in the comments. What part of this tale surprised you the most? And if you're into stories that make history feel alive, consider subscribing so you never miss what comes next. In the spring of 1943, a short memo crossed the desk of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. It was not marked with urgency. It carried no strategic maps, no casualty figures, no demands for troop deployments. It was about a beverage, a company, a question of morale. The memo, drafted by military logistics staff and executives from the Coca Cola Company, proposed something unprecedented. That Coca Cola should be declared an essential wartime commodity. Not a treat, not a luxury, but a part of the war effort itself. Roosevelt signed off. And with that single decision, the gears of the most powerful industrial engine on Earth began to turn. Not just for bullets and bombers, but for bottles of soda. To the untrained eye, this might have seemed absurd. Why prioritize soft drinks when every gallon of fuel and every inch of cargo space was critical? But for American high command, the question answered in the muddy fields of North Africa and the rocky coasts of Sicily. Morale was not a detail. It was a weapon. American soldiers were fighting in places they could barely pronounce, facing death daily, surrounded by unfamiliar terrain, hostile skies, and constant fatigue. What the Coke bottle represented was not comfort. It was connection, a sip of home, a symbol of routine, a reminder that the world they left behind was still there, still intact, and still thinking of them. The War Department authorized the Coca Cola Company to build portable bottling plants in every major theater of war. These were not simple machines. They were entire logistical units, loaded onto trucks, ships, and even aircraft. They traveled alongside the soldiers, often arriving just behind the front lines, and they operated with military precision. Each mobile unit could produce up to 30,000 bottles of Coca-Cola per day. In Italy, in Burma, in the Pacific Islands, In the forests of Belgium, wherever American boots touched soil, Coca Cola followed. Engineers modified refrigeration systems to work in desert heat. Supply officers built entire distribution trees to ensure the glass bottles remained intact during transport. Shipping manifests began to include syrup barrels and carbonation cylinders right next to ammunition crates. And all of it was done without slowing the war effort. This was the hidden brilliance of American industry. It was not just about building weapons. It was about building systems, interchangeable, replicable, and infinitely scalable. The same trucks that moved artillery could move soda. The same warehouses that stored spare tank parts could store bottles. The same mentality that created the Liberty ship, assembled in 42 days or less, now applied to refreshing troops in the field. And it worked. Soldiers wrote home about it. "They got us Cokes today. You'd think it was Christmas." Others mentioned trading them with local civilians who had never seen such a thing. Some officers even used Coca Cola as an informal reward system. Complete a dangerous mission? Here's a bottle. Survive a bombing raid? Have a Coke. This drink, born in Atlanta and raised in America's golden age of advertising, was now part of the most complex war machine in history. Not because it was sweet, not because it was cold, but because it was consistent, familiar, American. Meanwhile, Axis intelligence was baffled. Reports began filtering in. American convoys carrying crates of soda. Field hospitals distributing bottles to the wounded. Even behind enemy lines, rumors spread that the Americans brought soft drinks wherever they went. German officers could not understand it. Why would a military force waste energy on beverages? But they missed the point. It was never just about the beverage. It was about what the beverage proved. That American supply chains were so robust, so well-engineered, so far-reaching, that even a glass bottle of Coca Cola could be treated like a military necessity. Behind every bottle was a statement. We are not just here to fight. We are here to stay. This quiet message traveled across battlefields and borders. It told the world that the United States had not only the strength to wage war, but the will to bring its identity with it, its habits, its symbols, its culture. It was a form of soft power hidden in plain sight. Even in the Pacific, where logistics were stretched to the breaking point, Coca Cola plants were installed on remote islands. Engineers braved sniper fire and tropical disease to set up bottling stations under palm trees and next to machine gun nests. Photos survive of soldiers crouched behind sandbags, sipping Coca Cola as enemy fire crackled in the distance. This was not marketing. It was morale engineering. By late 1944, Coca Cola had more than 60 mobile bottling plants operating worldwide, each one staffed with trained technicians who were given military ranks and uniforms. They were not just employees. They were part of the force. They earned the nickname Coca Cola Colonels. These men and women became legends among the troops. Some units timed their operations to coincide with Coca Cola drops. Others shared bottles before going into battle, as if it were a ritual. Soldiers carved bottle caps into rings, lucky charms, or keepsakes. The drink became more than a beverage. It became a companion, a superstition, a reminder that the war would end and that life would one day return to normal. And this, more than anything, terrified the enemy, because behind every bottle was a factory, behind every crate, a ship, behind every sip, a nation that did not break under pressure, but adapted, evolved, scaled. And in that scaling, America found its edge. You wouldn't see it in the headlines. You wouldn't find it in most history books. But ask the men who were there. Ask the pilots, the infantry, the medics. Many would say the same thing. The arrival of Coca Cola in a war zone didn't just mean a break. It meant America had arrived. If this gave you a new way to look at the war, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Share your favorite detail or moment that stuck with you. And if you believe history should be told this way, hit that subscribe button so more people can discover the forgotten layers of the past. Somewhere outside Naples, July 1944, a convoy of American trucks groaned up a steep incline. Dust swirled around their wheels, blending with the heat waves rising from the road. Local farmers paused their work as they watched the unfamiliar procession climb the hill. What caught their eye was not the size of the vehicles or the sound of the engines. It was what the trucks were carrying. Not fuel, not rifles, not troops. Glass bottles, crates of them, stamped with a red and white label that had no place in war, or so it seemed. Coca Cola. To those outside the U.S. military structure, this felt like madness. But inside the logistics command, it was a master stroke. By 1944, Coca Cola was no longer just a drink. It had become a fully integrated component of the Allied supply chain, and its delivery system was built with the same precision and adaptability as any artillery unit or armored division. It began with a principle so simple, it almost went unnoticed. Every soldier, wherever he was in the world, should be able to drink a bottle of Coca Cola for 5 cents. That was the promise. That was the directive, and fulfilling that promise meant designing a global supply web that could flex, adapt, and operate under fire. Engineers began redesigning delivery systems. Pallets were modified for speed. Trucks were retrofitted with reinforced racks to prevent bottles from shattering on rough terrain. Some transport units carried nothing but soda, sealed under tarps alongside ammunition, fuel, and field rations. Each Coca Cola bottling unit was built to be mobile. They were compact, modular, and designed to run off any available power source. Gasoline, diesel, even generator-powered electricity scavenged from abandoned buildings. The units could be unpacked and operational within 48 hours of arrival in a new location. And once up and running, they didn't stop. Each plant worked in shifts, day and night. Operators, often enlisted men trained specifically for this job, monitored syrup levels, carbonation output, water purity, and glass bottle pressure. Military police guarded the stockpiles like they would munitions. In fact, some areas used old munitions storage facilities to house the bottles, keeping them shielded from the sun and protected from enemy aircraft. In North Africa, distribution lines stretched across open desert. The heat made bottle preservation a constant battle, but refrigeration units were installed in makeshift shelters built from canvas and corrugated metal. In Burma, bottling teams fought off insects, humidity, and jungle rot. And in the Pacific Islands, where fresh water was often scarce, engineers filtered and purified local sources to meet Coca Cola's strict standards. Every drop of water was tested. Every cap was sealed with care. Every bottle was tracked. Soldiers in the field knew the routine. If a shipment arrived, there would be a brief moment before orders were barked and maps unfolded when the boxes were opened, not to check for enemy code books or rations, but to see if any of those unmistakable glass necks were sticking out. It was not just about taste. It was about pattern, rhythm, familiarity. The bottle had become ritual. You could see it in the photos. Soldiers on break, perched on sandbags, sipping from the curved glass, as if to remind themselves that this war, no matter how inhuman, still made room for something human. For one brief moment, in between life and death, a small symbol of normal life returned. There were stories, some passed around in campfire whispers, others written in letters home, about what those bottles meant. A Marine on Iwo Jima was said to have kept an empty Coca Cola bottle tucked into his pack the entire campaign. Another soldier, recovering in a field hospital, claimed his first thought when he woke up from surgery wasn't whether he'd survive, but whether someone had saved him a Coke. Supply officers reported a strange phenomenon. Whenever Coca Cola arrived at a forward base, discipline subtly improved. Tensions eased. Arguments faded. It was as if morale traveled inside the bottle, carbonated and compressed, waiting to be released. Even commanding officers took notice. Some units began scheduling brief pause points after particularly brutal missions, not just for recovery, but to allow time for soldiers to cool off with a bottle of Coke. These breaks were unofficial, but they spread quickly. In the chaos of war, consistency was sacred, and Coca Cola delivered it in glass, one crate at a time. Meanwhile, the Axis observed with disbelief. They intercepted logistics records showing American supply columns carrying soda. Prisoners of war spoke about it openly, sometimes with a strange mix of confusion and awe. Even in the heart of Berlin, scattered reports from the front described the absurd image of American soldiers unloading soda alongside tanks. What they did not understand was that those bottles were not just there by coincidence. They were part of a larger doctrine, one that believed that soldiers fought better when they remembered what they were fighting for. American command recognized that a Coke bottle could do something a bayonet could not. It could remind a man of his street corner back home, his family porch, the sound of a jukebox in a diner, the hum of normal life. Coca Cola became part of the uniform, not stitched to fabric, but etched into the experience. It rode in pockets, sat next to radios, clinked inside helmets when the bottles were empty, and the caps were turned into good luck charms. And it was scalable. That was the real genius. The same systems that delivered tanks, radios, and food now delivered culture, identity, emotion, all wrapped in something cold and fizzy. And the enemy had nothing to match it. By the time the war reached its final years, Coca Cola was being bottled in places the company itself had never dreamed of. On remote islands where there were more crabs than people. In bombed-out buildings repurposed as distribution centers. Under the wings of B-17s, waiting for their next mission. And no matter how far the front line moved, Coca Cola moved with it. If stories like this shift the way you see war, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Every bottle has a story, and every story adds depth to history. Subscribe now if you believe these details deserve to be remembered, not erased. Near the outskirts of Cassino, Italy, a young American corporal sat on a collapsed stone wall, his boots caked in mud, and his fingers trembling from exhaustion. He had not slept in 2 days. He had not spoken in 1. The fighting had been brutal, the kind that does not announce itself with glory, but settles into the bones like a weight. Around him, the sound of artillery still echoed in the mountains, distant but close enough to keep the adrenaline alive. And then someone handed him a bottle of Coca Cola. It was cold, somehow. He stared at it for a long second, unsure if it was real or another hallucination brought on by fatigue. He cracked the cap. The hiss was soft, almost tender, and when he drank, something shifted. It was not relief, not even joy. It was recognition. In that moment, the war fell away just long enough for his mind to remember what peace tasted like. This is what Coca Cola had become. Not just a beverage, not just refreshment, but memory. Portable, familiar, tangible memory. Soldiers wrote about it constantly, in letters home, in private journals, in passing conversations. Had a Coke today became shorthand for, I'm still human. In the middle of carnage, surrounded by death and decay, the smallest act of sipping a curved bottle offered a thread to a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. For some, it was the only normal thing left. In northern France, a medic named Private Allen kept 2 unopened Coca Cola bottles tucked under his cot. He never drank them. He said they reminded him of his father's gas station back in Michigan, where he used to sit on the curb after school and drink a bottle while waiting for the afternoon bus. During heavy bombardments, he would reach under the cot, feel the glass, and hold it for a few seconds until his hands stopped shaking. In the Pacific, one Marine had a different ritual. Before every patrol, he would pour a small splash of Coke onto the ground, for luck, for those who would not return. It was his version of prayer. There were countless stories like these, quiet, almost invisible acts of connection. Coca Cola had entered the emotional bloodstream of the war effort. It was not propaganda. It was not marketing. It was presence. And presence mattered more than most people understood. Morale is often treated as a vague term in war, but on the battlefield, it is a measurable force. It decides whether a soldier pulls the trigger or hesitates, whether he holds the line or breaks, whether he can walk 1 more mile with blistered feet or collapses in the mud. Commanders knew this, which is why morale was cultivated as carefully as any strategy. But while orders could be barked and formations drilled, morale required something more fragile, something that could not be commanded but could be nurtured. A photo from home, a cigarette before a mission, and in the case of thousands, a bottle of Coke. It became a symbol of continuity. War tears, time apart. It severs the before from the now. But Coca Cola bridged that divide. It was the same bottle in New York and Normandy, in Georgia and Guadalcanal. The same sound when opened, the same taste. Soldiers clung to it not because it was extraordinary, but because it was consistent. It was proof that some things had not changed. It was also proof that someone, somewhere, cared enough to get it to them. there is a different kind of power in that. Knowing that a supply chain hundreds of miles long had been stretched and protected just so you could have a sip of soda. It was like receiving a letter, not in words, but in flavor. A silent message that whispered, "We have not forgotten you." In field hospitals, Coca Cola played a quiet role in recovery. Nurses used it to coax wounded men to sit up, to swallow pills, to fight through fevers. Sometimes the wounded could not speak, but when handed a Coke, their expression would change. The bottle acted as a small permission to feel human again. There were even moments when the drink crossed enemy lines. In Italy, after a skirmish had left both sides battered, a brief ceasefire was declared to collect the dead. In the awkward silence that followed, an American lieutenant offered a bottle of Coke to a German soldier who had just buried a friend. The German took it, nodded once, and drank without a word. Then he passed it back, empty. That moment never made it into reports, but it lived in the memory of those who saw it. It was not a symbol of surrender. It was a symbol of shared humanity. This was the paradox of the bottle. It traveled with guns, but brought a piece of peace. It came to war, but carried something older than conflict. It was culture made liquid, identity in glass, and its presence shaped rhythm of life behind the lines. In downtime, soldiers didn't just rest. They gathered. They passed bottles around. They joked. They remembered. Coca Cola created moments of pause, of laughter, of contrast. In a world where everything was uncertain, even the smallest certainty became sacred. And so, the bottle became more than glass and syrup. It became a ritual, not just for the Americans, but for the people who watched them. Locals in war-torn villages, many of whom had never tasted soda in their lives, began to associate the red label with something hopeful. A promise that things were changing, that maybe liberation came not just in the form of tanks and planes, but in small, cold bottles, handed out by smiling strangers in strange uniforms. Because when a soldier gives a child a Coca Cola in the middle of a ruined street, something unspoken passes between them. Not a transaction, but a moment, a beginning. And those beginnings multiplied. So the next time you see an old photo of a soldier with a Coca Cola in hand, look closer. You are not just looking at refreshment. You are looking at a lifeline, at a thread that tied men to the world they left behind and pulled them, bottle by bottle, through a war that threatened to devour everything. If that image stayed with you, share your thoughts in the comments. These are the details that bring history to life. And if you believe the past is worth remembering like this, go ahead and subscribe to be part of the journey. Captain Haas reviewed the report with a tight jaw and furrowed brow. It had come in from the Western Front, smuggled across occupied territory through fragmented intelligence channels. The message was not about troop movements or tank divisions. It was not about fuel shortages or supply lines. It was stranger than that. American forces had begun to deliver Coca Cola not only to their own troops, but to local populations. And more than once, those bottles had been exchanged for information, directions, safe passage, silence. At first, the German High Command dismissed it. Another ridiculous rumor, like the one about Hershey bars wrapped in propaganda leaflets. But then the pattern kept emerging. From Sicily to St. Lo, locals were seen gathering around American outposts, not to beg, but to barter. Not for bread, but for bottles. It was subtle, but it was real. What most German officers still failed to grasp was this: Coca Cola was not just a morale booster anymore. It had evolved into a tool of influence, a lubricant for local cooperation, a silent ambassador of American presence. In some parts of France, the arrival of Coca Cola preceded the arrival of American uniforms. Locals began to associate the red script on glass with liberation. It became a signal, a whisper that the tide of war was turning. And for the Americans, that shift held strategic value. In a war that relied on local intelligence, terrain guidance, and civilian neutrality, small gestures became powerful. Currencies. A bottle of Coca Cola, cold and unopened, carried a different kind of authority. It was proof of abundance, of reach, of trust. When handed to a farmer or a shopkeeper in a war zone, it said more than any leaflet ever could. It said, "We are here. and we are not going anywhere. On the front lines, these transactions happened quietly. A soldier offering a bottle to a boy who had just pointed toward a minefield. A sergeant giving one to a priest who had allowed radio operators to set up in his chapel. These were not official orders. They were organic, intuitive decisions, but they worked, and their effectiveness began to show up in the numbers. Officers reported fewer ambushes, better cooperation from civilians, improved intelligence accuracy. Coca Cola was becoming tactical. It was never advertised that way, of course. There was no manual that instructed troops to use soft drinks as leverage. But in a conflict defined by improvisation, soldiers adapted, and they understood, instinctively, that the bottle they carried in their pack might one day save their lives in a way no rifle ever could. In the North African campaign, one unit famously secured cooperation from a local village, not with bribes or threats, but with a wooden crate of Coca Cola and a tin of cigarettes. In return, they were given access to a freshwater well that saved the entire company during a heat wave that killed dozens elsewhere. That story was never written down in official records, but it was retold in tents for weeks afterward. On the Eastern Front, where brutality had erased the line between combatants and civilians, such exchanges were rare. But in Western Europe, where the Americans advanced town by town, road by road, the psychological dimension of Coca Cola became more visible. It was not only a symbol of comfort, but a quiet signal of shifting power. Even enemy forces began to take note. Captured German soldiers were questioned about their impressions of American logistics. Many of them mentioned the trucks, the planes, the sheer volume, but a surprising number brought up the drinks. One officer, when interrogated, said with disbelief, "They fight with cold soda in their hands, and they still win." It disturbed the image of American weakness that German propaganda had worked so hard to create. These were not spoiled boys from across the ocean anymore. They were disciplined, equipped, and supported by a machine so vast that it could afford to deliver refreshments into hell and bring them back intact. For the enemy, this created something deeper than envy. It created confusion. How could a military force fight like this and not collapse under its own weight? How could they be so casual and still be so lethal? And more troublingly, what did it say about the future? Because if a country could invade your continent while sipping Coca Cola, what else could it do? This unease was not limited to soldiers. Civilians under occupation began to whisper about it. Children passed rumors about American soldiers who gave away soda like it grew on trees. In places where scarcity ruled everything, Coca Cola became a myth, a dream object. And when it finally appeared, it did not feel like an invasion. It felt like a return. In Italy, one young girl would later recall in an interview how her first taste of Coca Cola came from an American soldier in Naples. He handed it to her with a smile and walked away. He had never seen glass that smooth, never heard that gentle hiss as the cap was turned. For years after the war, she would keep the bottle on her windowsill, even after the label faded. To her, it was not a drink, it was a beginning. This kind of influence could not be calculated with maps and flags. It moved through gestures, through impressions, through stories passed down between friends and family. And over time, Coca Cola became one of the most potent symbols of American soft power the world had ever seen. But it also carried a warning. Because behind every bottle, behind every crate unloaded with laughter, there was still a convoy, a factory, a war engine humming with industrial precision. And that engine did not rest. It did not slow. It did not run out. While the Axis rationed fuel and salvaged scrap metal from bombed cities, the Americans kept shipping soda by the ton. This imbalance began to feel like something more than tactical advantage. It began to feel like destiny, as if the war had already been decided, and the bottle was merely the first taste of the future. And for those who realized it, that realization came too late. If this reshaped how you see power in wartime, take a second to share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know how this chapter of history hit you personally. And if you believe stories like this need to be told with care and truth, tap that subscribe button and stay with us as we uncover more. By late 1944, in the meeting rooms of the German High Command, Silence had become more dangerous than shouting. Reports piled higher each week, and many of them contained details that no one knew how to interpret. Not failures of strategy or terrain, not surprise offensives or weather delays. Those were expected. What began to unsettle the minds of seasoned officers were the strange consistencies coming from the field. Captured prisoners spoke of it. Civilian informants repeated it. Even intercepted letters hinted at it. The Americans had Coca Cola, not just in cities or in the ecourse rear, but in trenches, on patrol, in makeshift command posts, hidden in forests. The bottle appeared again and again in contexts that made no sense to a German officer. How could a nation conduct full-scale warfare on multiple continents and still deliver soft drinks to the front line? General Franz Richter, a veteran of both world wars, once slammed his fist on the table after reading a decoded Allied radio transmission. It had detailed resupply efforts following a skirmish near the French town of Metz, ammunition, medical kits, food rations, winter uniforms, and Coca Cola. He read it again, blinking slowly. His officers waited for his reaction. He stood up, looked out the window, and simply muttered, "They are laughing at us, and we do not even understand the joke." He was not wrong, because for the men on the other side of the line, it was more than just a laugh. It was a rhythm, a psychological loop. Wherever Coca Cola appeared, it brought with it the unmistakable feeling that the Americans were not just surviving the war, they were living through it with their identity intact, even under fire. A German sniper team stationed near Bastogne recalled watching a group of American soldiers taking cover behind a wrecked tank during an artillery exchange. Between the blasts, they noticed something absurd. One of the Americans raised a bottle of Coke, wiped the rim with his sleeve, and took a sip. Then he passed it to the man beside him. The snipers did not fire, not because they hesitated morally, but because they were paralyzed by confusion. What they witnessed was so out of place, so unreal, that it broke the logic of war for a moment. Were these men even afraid? This reaction became more common than any officer would publicly admit. Soldiers on the German side had grown used to scarcity. Coffee made from roasted acorns, boots patched 3 times over, rations thinned to near starvation levels. Even the basics, soap, tobacco, mail, were luxuries. Cold soda into a battlefield felt not only decadent, but impossible. And yet, the Americans did it, routinely. For German troops, the psychological weight of this contrast became harder to ignore. They began to speak about it in whispers. Some called it arrogance. Others saw it as madness. But deep down, the truth was more dangerous. It was working. The Americans were pushing forward. The momentum was real, and with each advance, that bottle seemed to reappear. In village squares, in captured bunkers, in newly dug foxholes, still warm with the heat of recent firefights. One German sergeant, wounded and captured near Aachen, spoke to his interrogators about this very thing. What had shocked him most, he said, was not the firepower or the numbers. It was the attitude. He described it as something closer to confidence than cruelty. The belief that this war would end, and that they were simply passing through it like a storm, holding on to pieces of their former lives, like that strange American soda. He paused, then he said something that stuck with the officers who heard it. "When I saw them drinking Coca Cola after a bombardment, I stopped believing we could win." He was not alone. There were dozens of reports like his, quiet admissions tucked between lines of formal military intelligence. None of them described the taste of defeat in technical terms, but all of them pointed to the same unsettling truth. The Americans were fighting a war and bringing a piece of peace with them, and it changed everything. Because in war, dominance is not only measured by destruction, it is measured by belief, by which side controls the narrative, by who seems inevitable. And for many on the German front, that inevitability came not with a tank or a plane, but with a glass bottle, dripping with condensation, opened with a hiss that sounded like history exhaling. Even among the civilians, this shift was felt. In village after village, people watched American troops arrive with a strange mixture of fear and fascination. They came not only with uniforms and rifles, but with chewing gum, cigarettes, and Coca Cola. And this unspoken display, this casual distribution of small luxuries, reprogrammed how people saw the invaders. They did not seem like occupiers. They seemed like a new world arriving in real time. To the Germans who still believed in the righteousness of their cause, this cultural invasion was almost more painful than military defeat. It was not just that they were losing ground. It was that they were being outlived, outsupplied, outremembered. The war for hearts and minds, so often talked about in vague terms, was being won one bottle at a time, and even the most disciplined men began to feel it. There were reports of German soldiers stealing Coca Cola from captured American vehicles, not to trade, but to taste, not to survive, but to remember, in secret, in shame. Some of them had seen the bottle before the war, in Berlin, in Hamburg, through the Coca Cola GmbH branch that had operated in Germany since the 1920s. But that era felt like another life, a different world, one where Germany had been part of something global, instead of locked in a death spiral. Now the bottle returned as a messenger, a signal, a reminder that the world they tried to reshape had never truly left. It had only waited, and now it was coming back with force. If this gave you a deeper perspective on the psychological war beneath the surface, take a moment to leave a comment. These are the moments history often overlooks. And if you value truth told with weight and clarity, consider subscribing. Every detail remembered keeps the past alive. Across the scorched ruins of Europe, one truth began to settle into the minds of those who watched the Americans advance. It was not just the flags, the tanks, or the endless columns of men that struck fear and confusion. It was the rhythm, the sheer consistency of their arrival, their ability to keep moving forward, always supplied, always fed, and somehow still able to hand out bottles of Coca Cola while doing it. The German war machine had been built on elegance and engineering, on the idea that war should be fought with precision and discipline. From the Panzers to the Messerschmitts, the emphasis had always been on excellence, the perfect tank, the perfect gun, the perfect formation. Everything honed, measured, exact. But perfection had a cost. It required time. It demanded resources, tolerated no margin for error. And by 1944, error was everywhere. Factories bombed, rail lines shattered, fuel stockpiles vanishing faster than they could be replaced. German tanks, that had once symbolized invincibility, now sat idle in forests, out of gas. Pilots flew missions with barely enough fuel to return. Entire divisions were left behind because there were no trucks to carry them. The machine was grinding down, slowly, irreversibly. On the other side of the line, something very different was happening. The American system was not designed for precision. It was designed for pressure, for volume, for movement. It was chaos made efficient. The Sherman tank was not better than the Tiger. It was worse in almost every measurable way. Thinner armor, shorter range, weaker gun. But the Americans could build 5 for every one Tiger, and they did. And when one was destroyed, another rolled in, and another, and another. The same logic applied to everything, from boots to bombers to breakfast. If it could be standardized, it could be multiplied. If it could be multiplied, it could be delivered. And if it could be delivered, it became part of the system. Coca Cola was part of that system. It was not just an afterthought or a morale boost. It was an industrial product treated with the same seriousness as munitions. Bottling plants were built alongside tank depots. Delivery routes were optimized not just for weapons, but for refreshment. There were maps showing how long it would take to get a bottle of Coke from a factory in Algiers to a foxhole in Normandy. And those timelines were met. That was what disturbed the Axis most. Not the power of the products, but the power of the process. Because this was not war as Germany knew it. This was not honor and strategy on a chessboard. This was a factory with guns, a production line with boots, a nation that could send both bullets and soda across oceans without breaking rhythm. For every soldier holding a bottle of Coke, there were hundreds of workers behind him. Engineers, welders, machinists, dockhands, drivers, dispatchers, chemists, radio operators, men and women who never fired a shot but kept the machine alive. That machine was unstoppable, not because it was perfect, but because it was patient, relentless, forgiving of mistakes. built to absorb damage and keep going. In contrast, the German system had no tolerance for collapse. It needed perfection, and perfection is fragile. In one infamous December report, 1944, a German logistics officer remarked that the Americans seemed to operate under a different set of physical laws. How else, he asked, could they bring fresh food, cigarettes, socks, and soda to every battlefield, even as shells fell around them? He called it inhuman resilience. But it was not inhuman. It was human, massively human. A reflection of a country that had learned to weaponize its lifestyle, to turn comfort into infrastructure, to make everyday culture travel. Alongside military might, Coca Cola was the clearest example of that philosophy. Not just because it was sweet or refreshing, but because it was symbolic. It represented abundance, predictability, identity. The idea that no matter how far from home a soldier went, home could still follow. German soldiers who stumbled across abandoned American outposts often found empty bottles scattered among the debris. The labels were still visible, the glass sometimes unbroken. For those who saw them, they were like footprints of a ghost that never stopped marching. In one abandoned village near the Rhine, a German lieutenant stepped into a shelled house and found a single bottle sitting on a windowsill, the label facing outward, sunlight catching the red. It was empty, but clean, untouched by the dust and blood that covered the rest of the room. He did not touch it, he just stared. Because that bottle said more than any banner or slogan ever could. It said, "We were here." It said, "We will be back." It said, "This war is not yours to win." What the German command had once dismissed as weakness now stood as proof of dominance. The bottle that had been mocked had become an omen, and slowly it changed the way they thought. They began to fear not just the weapons, but the will, the rhythm, the consistency. The fact that Coca Cola could arrive at the front meant that everything else could too. That this was not just a military operation, it was a civilization moving forward with full momentum and no intention of stopping. The Allies did not just bring soldiers, they brought systems, they brought habit, and the world that followed would belong not to the best designed machine, but to the most durable one. If you've made it this far, share with us in the comments what this part made you feel or think. Did it challenge something you believed about the war? Every story deserves to be felt, not just learned. And if these forgotten angles matter to you, hit that subscribe button so we can keep bringing them into the light. Berlin, May 1945. The streets were silent, except for the distant creak of crumbling stone and the occasional bark of a lone soldier still carrying out orders that no longer mattered. Smoke drifted between collapsed buildings like a ghost refusing to leave. And above it all, the flags had changed. The thunder was gone. What remained was a quiet that felt heavier than any explosion. In those final days, as the Third Reich gasped its last breath, many Germans looked around and realized they had misunderstood the war from the beginning. It had not been a contest of weapons alone, or of tactics, or even ideology. It had been something far more relentless. It had been a war of endurance, of systems, of identity. And America had brought all three in full. The soldiers who now patrolled the ruins were young, often no older than 22. They carried rifles, yes, but also radios playing jazz, magazines, photographs of home, and for those with sharp eyes, one detail kept reappearing: bottles, glass bottles with red labels, Coca Cola. What had once been a joke among the officer class now stood as a quiet monument to everything the Germans had failed to understand. They had laughed when they saw it. They had mocked the idea that a soldier could drink soda in the middle of war. They had ridiculed the culture that prioritized taste, comfort, and routine. But they were not laughing anymore, because that same culture had outproduced them, outlasted them, outpaced them in every measurable way. By the end of the war, the Coca Cola Company had produced over 5 billion bottles for the Allied forces. More than 60 bottling plants had been built or relocated overseas. Thousands of uniformed technicians, some of them given honorary military ranks, had worked around the clock to ensure a constant supply. It had been a logistical miracle, not just because of the scale, but because it never failed, not once. Even in the ruins of Europe, the bottle kept arriving, In one of the first recorded moments after the liberation of a German concentration camp, American medics gave survivors sips of Coca Cola, not as celebration, not as symbol, but simply because it was what they had. It was what they carried. And in that moment, the drink became something else, something almost sacred, a small, sweet gesture in a place where everything had been bitter. The war was over, but the memory of it would echo for generations. And within that memory, the image of a glass bottle, curved, cool, familiar, would linger. Because Coca Cola had traveled farther than most tanks. It had crossed oceans, climbed mountains, landed on beaches, and rolled through deserts. It had comforted the wounded, steadied the scared, and reminded millions of what home tasted like. It had never fired a bullet, but it had won something else. It had shown the world that war was not only about destruction, it was also about preservation, about the power of carrying something ordinary into the extraordinary, about keeping identity alive when everything else tried to strip it away. And in that sense, the bottle was not weak, it was unbreakable. Long after the uniforms were folded and the flags replaced, long after the noise of war was replaced by the rebuilding of cities and the grieving of families, the stories remained. Stories passed from veterans to their children, from old photographs to new questions. And in many of those stories, the bottle appeared again, not as a hero, not as a myth, but as a witness. It had seen it all, the hope, the fear, the exhaustion, the victory, and it reminded all who held it that even in the darkest places, something light could still exist. Thank you for walking with us through this journey, through facts, through emotion, through memory. History is not just what happened, it is what we choose to carry forward. If this story touched you, leave a comment below. Share what you learned or what made you pause. Would love to hear your voice in this ongoing conversation. And if you believe these stories deserve to live on, hit that subscribe button and join us. Another video is waiting for you on the screen. Click it and keep exploring the stories history almost forgot. Until next time, remember, even a bottle can become a symbol, and sometimes symbols endure longer than empires.